sponsored by Refuse Fascism and the Revolution Nothing Less show. This is the third and final forum in a series of discussions that dig deeply into the roots of fascism that has grown and hardened over the past 4 years, and is still with us as tens of millions of people voted for Trump. I encourage you to check out the first two forums, What Just Happened, Trump, America, and the Danger of Fascism, and Why Did 74 Million People Vote for Trump? And you can find both of those at refusefascism.org. Tonight, we're going to examine the causes and implications of a terrifying situation. The US has the highest number of COVID-19 cases in the world and the highest number of deaths, recently surpassing 300,000. This has occurred under a science-hating, genocidally racist, lunatic fascist regime, with thousands more projected to die before Trump leaves office. The Trump-Pence regime, the Republican-fascists, and their rabid base spread COVID as a matter of liberty, the liberty to infect and kill others. Trump recovered from COVID with the best healthcare in the world, and then told his overwhelmingly white followers at a campaign rally in Minnesota that they have, quote unquote, good genes. The regime's COVID response concentrates many of the features of this fascist program: white supremacy, hatred of foreigners, a theocratic Christian fascism, and unhinged conspiracy theories. How did we get to this point? Why have we tolerated a regime that has facilitated the deaths of 300,000 disproportionately Black and brown people? Is this deliberate mass murder, or is it collateral damage in service of a fascist and fundamentalist worldview? How do we wage a society-wide struggle for truth, science, and evidence-based epistemology? After my opening remarks, you're going to hear provocative presentations from our panel. And then we're going to open it up for some discussion, and we expect to do all this in about 2 hours. Tonight, you're going to hear from Paul Street, historian and author of Hollow Resistance: Obama, Trump, and the Politics of Appeasement. He is a member of the editorial board of refusefascism.org and a frequent contributor to Counterpunch. Dr. Phil Rice is a leading physician of emergency medicine in Salem, Massachusetts, and Andy Z, host of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, co-initiator of refusefascism.org and spokesperson for Revolution Books. And my name is Coco, and I'm a writer and also a member of the editorial board of refusefascism.org. About a week ago, Diana Laciondo, a commissioner in Ada County, Idaho, abruptly left in tears a virtual meeting to discuss a mask mandate. The reason? Her 12 and 8-year-old son were home alone, terrified because protesters were outside banging on the window, screaming, blowing air horns, calling their mother a tyrant for advocating a mask mandate, and amplifying sound clips from the movie Scarface. These people were armed and should not really be called protesters, as they have no legitimate grievance. This was a mob threatening innocent people with violence, fighting for nothing more than the right to spread disease, the right to infect and endanger their neighbors, the right to reject science, truth, and any notion of a common good. Later, Laciondo wrote in a Facebook post, "Though I was born and raised in Idaho and have chosen to raise my own family here, I increasingly don't recognize this place. There is an ugliness and cruelty in our national rhetoric that is reaching a fevered pitch here at home, and that should worry us all." On Saturday, thousands of Trump supporters, including the Proud Boys and other white supremacist, anti-Semitic, Nazi militia groups, converged on DC for the second time in a month to rally for their president under the fiction of a stolen election, which Trump and his fascist allies have been bludgeoning the public with through outrageous lies and conspiracy theories, baseless lawsuits, threats against Republicans who wouldn't do his bidding, and trumpet calls to his tough people who rampaged through the streets that night, attacking people, vandalizing Black churches, and burning Black Lives Matter banners, conjuring images of KKK cross burnings and Hitler's stormtroopers smashing the windows of Jewish neighborhoods. And whose votes are they saying have stolen the election from Trump? The votes of Black people in the urban areas of swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia. Trump and his fascist backers are gnashing their white supremacist teeth, hardly subtle about their message. If only white people voted, Trump won by a landslide. On Monday, the Electoral College confirmed Biden's victory, though Trump's lies, threats, and attempted coup have not stopped. Fascists in and out of government will not stop fighting to re-seize power and consolidate fascist rule. If Biden is, as looks likely, sworn in as president on Inauguration Day, then we have succeeded in voting a fascist out of power. Not an easy feat, but we have not and cannot simply vote out fascism. It has been advanced through all levels of government, through the armed forces of the police, ICE, Border Patrol, and the military, and it has seized initiative in the streets. To stop this vicious American fascism that imperils the whole world, we must heed the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. We must demand an end to the death, lies, and fascism with a nonviolent mass movement that stands up for our values, respect for science, truth, diversity, and a love for humanity. We have to say in the public square, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Before we hear from our panelists tonight, we're going to watch a short video that was made a few weeks ago called "Trump Wants to Stay in Power? Oh, hell no." I want to thank you all for tuning in to this critical discussion. Let's begin.
Trump's trying to stay in power? Oh, hell no. Right now, we, the 77 million plus in this country who voted out the Trump-Pence regime, and the millions more across the globe who celebrated this are on the offensive. We have the momentum. We have the political initiative. They, the Trump-Pence regime and its supporters, are on the defensive. They have been politically knocked back on their heels. They have been thoroughly defeated and thoroughly repudiated. But we can't let up. We have to stay on the offensive because they are trying to pull some dangerous BS to stay in power. In the name of humanity, we cannot let that happen. Trump refusing to concede an election he lost by more than 5 million votes in the popular vote and a clear and convincing margin in the Electoral College? Oh, hell no. Trump's smirking Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, saying
there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
Oh, hell no. The Trump regime whipping up its dangerous supporters and going to court with the completely baseless and absurd allegations of supposed fraud? Oh, hell no. The Trump regime seeking to actively block a transition to a Biden administration in a deranged effort to remain in power? Oh, hell no. This is completely unacceptable. It cannot stand, and it will not stand. It's this simple. If you were in the streets celebrating Trump's defeat in the election, or if you took heart from these celebrations, then follow your own logic. Think for a second about all the reasons that you were so overjoyed. If you do that, you will see that you and we must stay in the streets until Trump's defeat is cemented and his entire regime leaves office. We demand Trump, Pence out now. Trump, Pence, Pompeo, William Barr, and the rest won't commit to leaving office in January? Then they can leave now. Actually, the Trump-Pence regime should have been out of office a long time ago. and Refuse Fascism has been saying that and working to organize people on that basis for years. If you've ever had any doubt about this, you should have none left now. Think about it. Why should this regime be allowed to stay in office one single day longer when they are threatening, refusing to accept, and actively attacking the elections and its results? Bring your energy, your joy, your anger, your determination, your dance moves, your pots and pans back into the streets to demand Trump, Pence, and the whole regime out now.
Welcome back to tonight's forum, COVID, a case study with life and death stakes, science, epistemology, conspiracy, and fascism, sponsored by Refuse Fascism and the Revolution Nothing Less show. We're going to jump right into our presentations now. And our first speaker is Paul Street, author of Hollow Resistance, Obama, Trump, and the Politics of Appeasement, and my colleague on the editorial board of refusefascism.org. Welcome, Paul. How are you doing tonight?
I'm all right. Thanks, Coco.
So we're eager to hear from you. So I'm gonna let you take the mic.
All right, very good. Here we go. The COVID pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, as it has played out in its favored country, the United States of America, is a tragedy. It will soon have claimed the lives of more than 1 in every 1,000 Americans. Think about that. But it is also a fascism-tinged crime rooted in this nation's multiple, overlapping, and mutually reinforcing structures, institutions, policies, and ideologies of inequality and oppression. It is an epitome of the failed state spiritual death and fascism that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said would befall this nation if it did not move off of what he called the triple evils that are interrelated: capitalism, racism, and imperialism, militarism. It is a crime of global capitalism, the rapacious and parasitic system that digs up zoonotic viruses from its ever-expanding geographical frontier and then sends those viruses around the world in the flash of an eye. Capitalism in its extreme U.S. form compels millions of vulnerable Americans to work without adequate virus protection or else go without money for purchasing life's necessities. It is a system that denies millions of Americans adequate health care and that disincentivized and prevented the provision and production of medical supplies, beds, personnel, and equipment to meet a pandemic that medical science and public health experts had been warning about for many years. It is an anarchic, competitive system that absurdly complicates medical production and distribution, and that renders hundreds of millions of Americans vulnerable to terrible outcomes by poisoning their bodies, air, water, and soil, toxic food, and toxic chemicals. COVID is a crime of American racism, which forces tens of millions of non-white Americans to live in overcrowded residences in communities without access to healthy food, medical care, and green space. Virulent American racism, which is as old as the Republic itself, concentrates millions of impoverished Black, brown, and red people into jails, prisons, detention centers, reservations, concentration camps that have proven to be COVID-19 breeding grounds and petri dishes. Racism concentrates non-white people in the most vulnerable jobs, in packing house kill floors in Iowa, Nebraska, in nursing home, and working as nursing home orderlies all across the nation. COVID-19 is a crime of American imperialism, which, among other things, steals resources from public health and medicine, taking money, skills, and personnel that should be invested in healing, and pouring all of that instead into a giant military death state that accounts for more than 40% of global war spending. If I had more time, and I don't, I'd talk about how COVID-19 is a crime of American sexism, of American individualism, of American federalism, of American nativism, of American right-wing evangelical Christianity, and of American anti-intellectualism, and even, ask me about this later, of American electoralism. But I want to get to the more central and more immediate culpability of Trumpism, fascism. I believe my fellow presenter tonight, Dr. Phil Rice, is going to get into some of the specifics on what was scientifically and medically necessary and how the Trump regime thwarted all of that in absolutely disastrous and despicable ways that have had made the world's so-called greatest country into a sanctuary nation for COVID-19, giving us more than a fifth of the world's COVID cases in a nation that accounts for less than a 20th of global population. But my thing is the why of that. The why of that criminal, mass murderous incompetence. And here I think it's a good place to set down a marker that sets refuse fascism and its allies a bit apart from the mainstream explanation. The mainstream standard common sense explanation of why Trump screwed up so badly on COVID-19, which, by the way, is written all over the front page New York Times piece today about how the Trump administration crushed the Center for Disease Control's COVID response capacity. But as far as I can tell, the mainstream common sense explanation is that Trump didn't want to do or say anything that might undercut the economic growth that he expected to ride to re-election this year. That's the main story that I expect to go into the liberal history textbooks that roll off the academic presses next year. And the problem with that conventional explanation is not that it's wrong. That's a huge part of it, absolutely a significant and central part of it. My sense, however, is that it was much worse than just that. And that alone was pretty awful, pretty criminal, pretty bad. My sense is that when the full story comes out, we, or those of us willing to look, are going to see that Trump's criminal COVID-19 conduct, we started calling it COVID-45, to be honest with you, this summer, that his criminal COVID conduct wasn't only about Trump's malignant narcissism and selfishness and electoral calculations, but was also about his and Stephen Miller and Tucker Carlson and the rest of the whole Republic-fascist empire's malignant fascism. And I think we'll learn that it was related to each of the following 9 fascistic characteristics of the Trump-Pence regime. 1, an eliminationist neo-McCarthyite desire to paint out the other major capitalist party as a totalitarian socialist enemy of personal freedom and supposedly glorious, wonderful capitalism. 2, white supremacist satisfaction with a virus that was disproportionately killing off people of color. 3, a related social Darwinian and even eugenicist comfort with COVID's disastrous impact on the aged and on the infirm, on the old and the sick, the people that the Nazis the surplus people that the Nazis considered, quote unquote, useless eaters. 4, an initial eliminationist calculation that the virus would mainly target cities controlled by the other major capitalist party, the disproportionately non-white blue metropolitan urban zones of the country. 5, a sexist, hyper-masculinist sense that masks and social distancing are signs of effeminate weakness and fear, not manly. 6, a passionate hostility to science that is particularly pronounced in American-style fascism because of the special strength of evangelical Christianity in the American right. 7, a personality cult built up around dear leader, stable genius Donald Trump, and a related sense that his instincts and the power of his will trumped any competitive claim to authority on the part of mere scientists and public health professionals. 8, the core fascist drive to purge all officials who are perceived as disloyal. And many folks in the bureaucracy just had too many loyalties to their own professions and their own scientific background to not get purged by Trump and not get crushed by Trump. 9th, the continuing but fascism intensifying war of the right, not on the state per se. That's an illusion. The claims of government that the right wing is anti-government are false. They're war not on the state per se, but on the left hand of the state. That is, on any parts of government that serve the broad majority of the population and social democracy and public health and the common good. I want to conclude with an irony. And this is actually something I wrote myself at some point in Counterpunch in the last few weeks. I remember writing a paragraph to this effect of, this fascist SOB, this fascistic regime that separated children at the border, that put kids in cages, that set up concentration camps, that tore up every environmental regulation, everything, all the things we didn't get impeached for. And just go through the list. We could stay here for 3 hours. All the worst sins and transgressions of the Trump regime this fascist regime probably would have got a second term, but for COVID, right? And I think that's true. The exit polling data I've seen on that really tells me that COVID really undid. If it wouldn't have given Trump an out-and-out electoral victory, the election would have been close enough for them to actually credibly have pulled off a coup and pulled off a steal. But there's a problem with this narrative, too. First one is COVID wasn't some outside externality or historical contingency that came out of nowhere and undid Trump. He blew COVID up. He needs to own this thing. That's why we called him COVID 45. He turned this, he turned the United States into COVID's top most favored nation in the world. And second of all, he did that because of the fascism. Not exclusively because of the fascism. A lot of things went into play in this. Capitalism is huge. But he did this largely because of the capitalism. I do want to finish off with informal, just shout out to Refuse Fascism. This aftermath, even as much as the regime itself, is living proof that Refuse Fascism and its allies had it correct. This is exactly how you would expect a fascist regime to respond to the loss of an election. This line that I'm hearing in intellectual circles that, the aftermath, the loss proves that we were crying wolf and that we were just raising alarms that we shouldn't have been and that we were hysterical. Look at the behavior since this regime. And look at the conduct that's clearly not going away anytime soon. And look at our slogan, out now. It was the right slogan, and it is still the right slogan. We are losing a 9/11 and a Pearl Harbor quantity of people every goddamn day in this country. This regime should be forced out immediately. It's doing everything it can to undermine a safe public health transition to the next government. It's criminal, it's profoundly transgressive, and it is fascist. I still say Trump, Pence, out now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you for that long view and a very thorough investigation into the various factors that contributed to this. And I think some of the things that you did not get to, I think we will get to in the discussion, I hope. So next, we're going to hear from Dr. Phil Rice. And Dr. Phil Rice was in the emergency room all day today and then braved a snowstorm up in Massachusetts, drove for an hour to get home and join us. So I'm very happy that you're safe home and that you could be with us tonight. How are you doing after your long day?
Well, I'm doing all right.
Great. So I know that our audience is eager to hear from you, especially as a frontline worker who has been healing and dealing with COVID-19 patients, and you also recovered from COVID yourself. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk. I wanted to kind of really speak about the two aspects of this disease that are basically impacted by both capitalism in general as well as by this fascist regime. And they intersect in many ways. This disease, as it first was unfolding, we as scientists and as physicians were communicating with other physicians around the world. There were different websites and different apps that we used to kind of exchange ideas and thinking. It was really a beautiful collage of international cooperation to fight a common enemy. And then all of a sudden, we saw various countries, including this country in particular, all of a sudden try and stymie all that. Everything became either an American thing or Italian thing. It truly was causing rebellion amongst all the different scientists that were fighting against this disease, because we recognize this disease is a zoonotic disease, one that doesn't really care about whether you're, a mammal or a bird, but has its bullseye on all human beings. And it doesn't matter what country you're from, and it doesn't actually care. And it will infect and kill at will if you do not prepare for for this pandemic. So in that light, I think that some of the unbelievable moves that were done to stymie this really smacked of the fascism that Trump represents. His backing out of the WHO was truly, that was just the icing on the cake. His defunding of the council in the White House that was preparing for pandemics and other assaults that may come our way, defunding it and putting his cronies in different levels of the CDC and the FDA. All these things were things that really strangled the ability of several different things to occur. So the first thing in terms of preparing for a pandemic is to try to prepare to stop the disease before it spreads. He had time. And this is one of the biggest and most damning things, is that he knew what this was. He knew how deadly it was. And yet he did absolutely nothing. He downplayed it. And this was truly criminal, to have this knowledge and not have at your fingertips the ability to mitigate this and to do absolutely nothing on purpose. So that's part of the first thing. And I think part of that had to do with this whole fascist sense of having to control the truth. And there's an old saying, if you take away truth, you can't speak truth to power. And when you've done that, all that's left is power, and that's what he wants. So I think that explicit downplaying and really seeing the effects of that nationalism on what it did to our ability to figure out where this virus was. Because without testing, and everybody remembers when we were trying to get testing, if you don't know where the virus is, how can you mitigate? How can you stop the spread? You can't. You can't quarantine. You can't do any of that unless you have testing. The WHO offered us a test way back in early February and said, this is the test we're using throughout the world. And they said, no, we want an American test. And the American test ended up taking close to 8 weeks after that to get out and to be used. And even then, in woefully pitiful small amounts, so that we couldn't really do the type of testing that was necessary in order to figure out where the virus was and how to mitigate its effects. Meanwhile, it was ravaging the Northeast at that time in early spring. And just like, this thing about this fascist extolling of the heartland while decrying the squalor of the urban area, that led to Trump saying, well, they ought to quarantine, New York City. The hell with them. He, in fact, decided to move out, move to Mar-a-Lago, et cetera. This is kind of like classic fascist appeal to the heartland, his social base or his fascist base. So the second thing you have to do is you need to lead the communications efforts and get out the word when outbreaks do occur. And basically all you heard was, this will go away. You didn't hear anything about where this virus is. You didn't hear anything about the steps you needed to take in order to mitigate the virus's effects. What you heard was, go ahead and ignore this. This won't hurt you. In the midst of the fact that thousands of people were dying. And that was actually thousands just in one city. And to think that that wasn't going to come to your city was just happy talk. So I think that this in and of itself is clear evidence that this guy really is a criminal in all respects. And I get the chance to talk to you all, but I know my colleagues who would love to tell you the moral trauma that they've experienced knowing that the person in front of them on that stretcher is dying because, and could have been avoided had the right things been done. And now they're in front of us, can't breathe. We're determining whether they need a tube in their lungs or not. And all because of what? Because of this guy, this fascist fool. So I think that, there are a bunch of things that we need to look at in terms of both the fascism, but also what capitalism just does in and of itself. I think that many of the things that you need to do from a public health stance have to rely upon mitigation and quickly enact policies and strategies that are going to stop the spread and save lives. And instead, what did you see? Over and over again. What was his message? His message was, let me have a MAGA rally where I'm going to display all the elements that you don't want to do in order to stop us and mitigate the spread of a virus. I'm going to have thousands at a rally, no mask, no social distancing, screaming their lungs out. What message does this give to anybody? What message does this give to the people of the world? Because we're not just talking about Americans, even though we live in this country. We're talking about the people of the world. This message is that it's a fascist message, that this virus, we can defeat it without science. We can defeat it by our gut instincts. We don't need to listen to pointy-headed intellectuals. And this is classic for a fascist, idiot. He wants to show how powerful and how macho he is and how tough he is, how he rips off the mask when he gets back to the White House after he's had the best and most advanced treatments that anybody could find anywhere, and many of which I still can't order or can't give to my own patients because they're on short supply, and they're actually, people may not know this, but there are lotteries to actually determine who gets some of these drugs, these infusions. The new BAM infusion, you have to get in a lottery because there's not enough for it to go around. But he got it. And then after he gets this and a bunch of other things, all of a sudden he's going to come out big and strong and say that everybody, this is nothing to fear, we can beat this. So lastly, I want to really hit on, and I'm hoping that we do get into a discussion about truth and the epistemology and that sort of stuff. I won't speak about it now, but early on, we kind of thought that we saw the disparities in this disease, where Black and Hispanic and Native American people were dying at much larger numbers than our white fellow Americans. And we were kind of looking at all sorts of things and trying to explain this. And initially we said, well, it's because of the exposure to hypertension and the other risk factors that Black and Latino Americans may suffer because of the way the system treats them, et cetera, and how they have to live. But then over the past few months, we decided to look at some of the data. What the data shows is even more damning. And what the data shows is that the case fatality rate among Black, white, Hispanics is identical. And what that means is it's not in the genes. What it means is that it's all about the exposure. It's all about where people live. It has nothing to do with genes. The households are more crowded. Many people work jobs that require frequent contact with others. And they rely on public transportation. The toll on Black and Hispanic Americans could easily have been ameliorated in advance of the pandemic by a less threadbare and cruel approach to social welfare and healthcare in this country. In the meantime, they're trying to get rid of and throw people off their healthcare by the millions. My colleagues in France and Italy were calling me saying, what is wrong with your country? First of all, we were worried about you because, at least in France, we have a national healthcare system where we can strategize where to put resources, how to move resources. My Italian buddy in Milan said the same thing. How are you guys going to do that? You guys don't even have a coherent system within one city, much less the whole country. And then what was Trump's response? Well, states, figure it out yourself. It's not my responsibility to figure this out. So when I talk about this moral trauma, what I'm talking about is that, and I think about what could we have done if we lived under a different system? Could we have protected citizens from risky work situations by providing some sort of way for them to stay home? And people said, well, geez, you gave the subsidies to the airlines and you gave them to the cruise ships, 40 billion and 60 billion apiece. And yet you couldn't help supply, safety for the basic masses. Seems kind of odd, but it's an indictment of this system. So the fact that people died in the same case fatality rate tells you that it's how people live and where people live and the conditions that they live. That's what killed them more than anything else. So yes, Trump had a whole list of fascist approaches to dealing with the pandemic, forcing scientists to defend their research and why they did that research, and then trying to control the message that they were trying to put out as the results of their research, preventing Fauci from even testifying in the House of Representatives. I think that blocking the dissemination from the MMWR, from the FDA and the CDC, that's made a lot of my colleagues say, geez, here's the new new magazines. Can we trust this because we know it's coming from the government? How many fingers have the politicians had in this message? And then we have to dissect it, whereas before we could rely upon this pretty easily. And then I think that, in terms of the nationalism and the continued nationalism, instead of the cooperation in the rest of the world, is really an indictment of all that we've seen. And we couldn't have the Trump-Pence regime leave soon enough. They've had this hand holding back everybody, trying to take care of patients, trying to control this virus, and we can control it. Now they have a problem. They've denigrated the science so much. How are they going to get people vaccinated? Who's going to believe the vaccination actually works? How are they going to do this now? Now you're going to go backtracking on this? There's been no effort to deal with the question of the effectiveness of the vaccine and why the vaccine may work. Because COVID is an RNA virus. And the vaccine that we currently are looking at takes a snippet that codes for a certain protein. It injects it into you. It's not the virus itself. It's just a snippet that actually codes for the protein that It's called an mRNA. You have lots of mRNA. That's how all your protein gets produced. That mRNA goes through something in the cell called a ribosome, and that ribosome spits out a protein. And that mRNA that went through it gets degraded and reused. Well, that protein is a foreign protein. Your body begins to find that protein in its bloodstream, and it forms antibodies to it. Your T lymphocytes, which are part of your immune system, start to recognize it and form memory about it. That's how this particular vaccine works. It's a novel one. We've never used it before, but it's the first time we've never injected an attenuated virus or a live virus in order to achieve immunity. The virus that's being used in the AstraZeneca trial in England, that's an attenuated adenovirus. And it's had its gonads removed, so it can't replicate inside you, but it too delivers the mRNA of the coronavirus. And that's how it produces its immunity. And there are other different ways to produce immunity. I will close by saying that we have a long way to go. We're going to see a lot more deaths because of what's happened. They've been unnecessary deaths. Do not let anybody tell you differently. This could have been avoided. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Phil. I think, one, it's very moving to hear you talk about how the scientific community, across borders, really went to work on trying to solve this problem, and how quickly that was thwarted and sabotaged by this nationalism and pettiness and the individualism that was like so concentrated in this regime. And the data about the death rates among white, Black, and Latino people. This is information that people so badly need, and I'm really glad that you were able to be here with us, and I'm excited to get into some of the discussion on these points later. Our next speaker is Andy Z, host of the Revolution Nothing Less show, and also a colleague of mine at Refuse Fascism. Welcome, Andy. How are you doing?
Okay, how are you, Coco?
I'm okay.
All right. Well, we're all of us are colleagues because Paul is on the editorial board of Refuse Fascism, and Dr. Phil Rice, besides somebody I've known for many years, is one of the first guests on the Revolution Nothing Less show, and we beat the rest of the media by almost 6 weeks in his report on the benefits of wearing masks, not just to protect oneself, but to protect others. So you heard it first here at the RNL show. So anyway, I'm glad to be with all of you.
Thank you. So I know we're eager to hear your presentation, so take it away.
Okay, so all of you, my co-panelists, have presented really compelling evidence of the criminal rejection and the outright opposition to science by the Trump-Pence regime. This regime's electoral defeat has focused up in a profound way how far detached from reality they actually are. Not only were the lawsuits filed by a demented Rudy Giuliani having no evidence, but literally crazy conspiracy QAnon theories were put forward to explain the imagined election theft. QAnon is a shadowy internet superspreader of fascist lunatic theories, such as that the Democratic Party is in reality a child kidnapping operation organized around capturing children to literally suck their blood. And after this election, we now have QAnon spouters who ran on, won, and will represent the Republi-fascist party of Trump and Pence in Congress. Lunacy like this, when laughed at and shrugged off, masks the danger to humanity that exists when a huge section of America is completely unhinged from reality and who fervently believe their alternate, fact-free reality as morally superior and existential for their lives. And this destruction of truth is a key factor in the forging of a fascist base, a fascist leader, and a fascist form of rule. We've lived it for 4 years, and it's been metastasizing for 40. Trump and Pence will likely be out soon, yet even as they are not yet gone, they can do enormous harm up until they no longer have their hands on the weapons of state power. But even out of power, this fascist danger will remain. So both Paul Street and Dr. Phil Rice have brought telling evidence that the Trump-Pence fascist regime's refusal to take and foster a scientific approach to the COVID virus has meant that the scientists, the medical researchers, and the frontline health workers, as well as the broad masses of people whose role in adopting safe practices to slow the spread of the infection was, and still is, decisive to slow the it's still decisive until the majority of people here and around the world are inoculated with this vaccine, with a safe and effective vaccine. And that this has led to an appalling criminal number of unnecessary death and disease. But I want to begin this talk by bringing in some additional evidence to the discussion. So we're just going to play a very brief video.
When we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear. And from our shores, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens.
So look, we laugh at this, especially at Sarah Cooper's hilarious mouthing of Trump's insanity. But this should be the door to a stark confrontation with the horror show that this ignoramus, this psychopath, this fascist has brought down on humanity. The absurdity of Trump's blathering accomplishes a purpose, a fascist purpose, the effect of which is potentially even deadlier than the cost and death and debilitating illness, because it destroys any sense of what is real and what is not, and how to determine what is true, without which people are susceptible to being manipulated, including to commit great crimes. And such buffoonery entertains the fascist base, who relish the fascist leaders' irreverence and feel validated in their resentment and their desire for revenge against those they have been taught to feel are taking from or looking down on them. But at the same time, the buffoonery captivates while it blinds liberals and progressives to confronting the enormity and the essence of what is going on, which is the fight at the top of society for a fascist form of rule, the shredding of all pretense of democracy, of a more blatant form of dictatorship of the capitalist system by the leader of the fascist party, and the forging of a different cohering set of values, of an amalgam of open white supremacy, patriarchy, and xenophobia, cohered with the mythology and the program of America First, undergirded by a fundamentalist Christian theocracy. I said this has been 4 years and 40 years. 40 years ago, in response to changes in the world and the risings of the 1960s, and what were resulting concessions to those struggles, resulting in even greater recognition of and inclusion of Black people, Latinos, Chicanos, women, and the gay rights movement. And after President Nixon was forced to resign, this hard right conservative movement coalesced behind Ronald Reagan. Let me clarify this. The movements of the 60s was not a hard right conservative movement. The hard right conservative movement is what was being rebelled against in the 60s. But then after Nixon was forced to resign, that movement regrouped and coalesced behind Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan put forth a messianic mythology of America as a shining city on a hill to prepare for an actual war against the then Soviet Union, and at the same time to wage a domestic war on these civil rights gains. A Republican coalition was forged with a strand of biblically literalist Christian evangelical movements to forge a base of what has become a Christian fascist movement, which reached power in 2016 through the unholy union of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. And this has become the core of the organized base of the Trump-Pence regime. These forces have been trained and forged in a belief system that is completely and dangerously disconnected from actual reality. This is a movement with a large section who believe in end times, which means they believe that they, the faithful, will be raptured, magically transported up to heaven, and thus nothing else matters. To hell with, quite literally, the environment, the danger of nuclear war, and all the people who they regard as less than or other than human, who they would just as soon see eliminated. And this movement has coexisted with a whole culture and media that has been training millions and millions of people in a mode of thinking of what benefits us, what benefits me is true because we want it to be so, with no criteria of actual evidence. This way of thinking, what benefits me, finds expression in their taking the very American concept of the absolute freedom of the individual, which is an undesirable impossibility in any case, as the greatest good. The concept of the absolute freedom of each person as the greatest good, again, an undesirable impossibility. We are living and dying with this in the morally sick and actual sickening spread of the virus in their refusal to wear masks expresses my right to be an asshole trumps your right to live, especially so if you're a Latino, Black, or Native American. And this fascist belief system is buttressed by twin pillars of American chauvinism that refuses to look at the history and the present-day reality of the United States, which has put this country in the vampire position of actually sucking the lifeblood of the rest of the world. The children who are digging in toxic conditions for precious metals for our cell phones in the Congo, or women risking their lives in the perilous garment shops of Bangladesh. Humanity whose lives and labor are being poured into the wealth of America and its imperialist allies and rivals. And buttressing this is an epistemology in which facts are subordinated to their desire to benefit themselves and take revenge upon those whom they believe stand in the way of their further gorging. But wait, we also have to look at the epistemology, which is the way of thinking, of the progressive and liberal strata. All those who've been outraged at the Trump-Pence regime, but who over 4 years overwhelmingly would not recognize or acknowledge what this regime actually is, a fascist regime with dire consequences for humanity here and around the world, and who up to this moment have refused to not only recognize and name this fascism, but to act against it in the only way it could really be rocked back on its heels, by getting out in the streets and sustain nonviolent protests. Well, I know these decent people, outraged by the bigotry of the Trumpites, may be made uncomfortable by confronting the reality that their complacency and putting their faith in the institutions and normal political processes, particularly the Democratic Party, is also based on the reality of living atop the food chain of capitalism imperialism in the US. Last April, the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian wrote a piece titled Conspiracy Theories, Fascist Certitude, Liberal Paralysis, or a Scientific Approach to Changing the World. And I'm going to read a substantive passage from this because it concentrates a great deal of what has plagued the millions of progressive people from acting in the way they should to drive this regime from power, and that has tremendous implications for the future. So I'm reading from his essay from early in the COVID crisis, April 2nd, I believe. Even as people in the medical field are proceeding on the basis of a scientific approach, and in the context of the coronavirus crisis, liberals are insisting that it is vitally important now to listen to the scientists. For far too long, many liberals and progressives have allowed themselves to become paralyzed by a relativist agnosticism, lacking, even rejecting the very idea of certitude, with ridiculous notions like, quote, how can you know what is really true? No one can say that their truth is greater than someone else's truth, and so on. Meanwhile, fascist forces, marked by a truly dark ages mentality, and firmly convinced of the truth of all manner of lunatic conspiracy theories promoting fascist values and objectives, are eagerly embracing callous Philistinism, willfully rejecting critical thinking, smugly ignoring, defying, and denigrating science and the scientific method. Put another way, in terms of major trends in society as a whole, those who have the most certitude are those who are the most out of touch with reality. And he goes on to say, further complicating the situation, and an additional dimension to this problem, is the fact that although they do not share, but strongly oppose the values and objectives of the fascists, many of the basic masses who are bitterly oppressed under this system are also suspicious of and are even inclined to reject science and scientifically grounded analysis. But this also leaves you vulnerable to all kinds of unfounded conspiracy theories and other wrong and harmful ideas, including the notion that nothing people do will make a difference because it is all in God's hands. End quote. All of this written in April has tremendous relevance right now. Look, there's great danger and no way forward for the interests of humanity in a society, in a culture of competing stories or narratives where you have your narrative and she has hers and I have mine. Look, we have different experiences, and those experiences and knowledge of them can contribute to our understanding of the world that we live in. But to understand the world, you need a scientific understanding that starts from the fact that there is only one reality that has many layers and complexity, but there is one objective world. Science means gathering the evidence and seeking the patterns in that evidence to reveal the connections and the pathways to identifying and understanding the underlying causes that give rise to the evidence, and then developing the ways to act on that reality. And this is true whether you are a scientist trying to discover the antibodies to prevent the spread of COVID, as Phil was talking about, or to save the environment, or you are applying the scientific method to overcome the exploitation and oppression, the wars and the divisions that so plague humanity today and themselves cause the lives of hundreds of millions of people. In this article, though, Bob Avakian goes on to say this, quote, "The truth of something does not depend on who says it or how it makes you feel. Because something comes from a source you like does not make it true. And because something comes from a source you do not like does not make it untrue. And truth is not a popularity contest. Because a lot of people believe something does not make it true, and because only a few people believe something does not make it untrue. Truth is objective, which means whether something is true or not depends on whether or not it corresponds to actual reality." And he goes on to say, quote, "To sort out what is false from what is true and to stand on solid ground in terms of understanding things, you need a scientific method and approach to reality, and yes, scientifically grounded certitude, where such certitude can and must be established." End quote. So for just a brief example of how we can apply science to society, and I'm going to compress here, how can we say, as we have, and I have said many times on the show, and Bob Avakian has written, that there is a straight line from the Confederacy to the fascism of the Trump-Pence regime? Well, by tracing its development in the history of the U.S., beginning with slavery written into the U.S. founding documents, by going deeper into its centrality of slavery and the oppression of black people to the development of the wealth in the US from the 17th up to and through the 20th century. The history of the betrayal of Reconstruction that ushered in the era of lynching and Jim Crow, through the current era of the new Jim Crow, where the police play the role of the KKK, and now the open white supremacy that was evidenced in the attempt of the Trump-Pence regime to discard the millions of urban black votes in cities that voted for Biden. And look, there's much more that I could go into here, but the point is, just as in the natural world, you go to the evidence, in this case, the history and the underlying economic and political forces that drive this white supremacy. And all of this is available in great detail and depth on the website in articles and films from Bob Avakian and articles from revcom.us, our website. This scientific method is at the heart of the work of Bob Avakian and is the defining character of his leadership. Bob Avakian, BA, has qualitatively developed the science of communism, the science of revolution, to chart the path to the emancipation of all humanity. And think about what it would mean if, under a totally different system that didn't set people against each other just to survive, and how that shapes people's thinking today, but instead there was a shared epistemology basing our lives and decisions on a collective process of discovering and acting on what was actually true, that would require a whole different system for that to be in effect. But imagine how different that would be. This is, as Bob Avakian has said, is what is needed to get to a world beyond where might makes right, which is what prevails in the world today. This is expressed in both Bob Avakian's personal character, and it is a hallmark of the principles of the new communism, which completely repudiate the notion that the ends justify the means, and that truth is just an instrument of desired objectives, rather than what it actually is, a correct reflection of objective reality. To all who reject the anti-science of the Trump-Pence fascist regime and the dangerous movement they have forged all the way up to the highest reaches of government, including dominating now the Supreme Court, this talk that I'm giving is a challenge and an invitation to you to be consistent and principled in your recognition of the importance of science, and to apply it not just where you feel comfortable in the prevention and curing of COVID, but as Bob Avakian concludes in this same article, quote, follow the truth where it leads, particularly when it comes to historical, social, and political questions. Because where it leads is to demolishing cherished ideals and prejudices of liberals regarding the actual role of this great American democracy through its history and throughout the world, the actual nature of the system we live under, capitalism, imperialism, and the actual experience of the revolutionary struggle against this system, and more particularly, the experience of the communist movement and the socialist societies it has brought into being, end quote. I conclude with this: a better world is possible. There is a way that everyone can be part of knowing and changing the world, in opposing the fascism of the Trump-Pence regime, and even more fundamentally, in making a radical leap beyond this capitalist imperialist system, which has given rise to this fascism, and bringing into being a far better world. You need the scientific method and approach of the new communism. So, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I think that was a really important examination of what science means and how it can be applied not only to disease prevention and understanding of the physical sciences, but to society. And I know that's a controversial point. And I also think it's very important for people to confront that we do have a society-wide crisis of epistemology, a crisis of the way that people think, and a denial of even the notion of truth and objective reality. And I hope we can get into that a little bit more in the discussion. So you've just heard three people give you a very multi-dimensional understanding of a very dire situation that we face with COVID-19. And I want to give the panelists a chance to reflect on what the others have said and think about where they agree and disagree and prepare for a lively discussion. But first, I want to take a moment and ask everyone in the audience to look at the graphic that should be up soon that tells you how to donate. And I want to ask you to give as much as you can to Refuse Fascism, which is a movement of people coming from diverse perspectives to stop a fascist America through sustained nonviolent mass protest. Think about this. Biden and other Democratic leaders are telling you that it's time to move on. And they're talking endlessly about reconciliation and reaching across the aisle to fascists who have put children in cages, ripped them away from their parents, unleashed white supremacist terror, torn up the norms and the rule of law, who have lied constantly in order to bend reality to their will, and a fascist movement that is responsible for the torture and deaths of countless people all over the world. Not because of mere incompetence, but because of deliberate cruelty that would usher in the future that they want. And at the same time, many other organizations and social movements have also moved on to talking about how to hold Biden accountable to a progressive agenda. But the elephant in the room is that we have a Nazi problem in this country. We have a problem of fascism. And they are fighting for the right to dominate over whole groups of people and their political enemies, and they're pursuing a genocidal program of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia. There can be no conciliating with that, and ignoring them will not make them go away. Fascists can and have come back from defeat, and when they do, they are more determined and more filled with vengeance. So who will lead the needed struggle to bring this fascist movement to a halt? Who will continue to organize the people of this country against a Christian fascist organizing machine and the agenda they are determined to advance through the courts and other seats of power? Who will provide the tools for understanding and stopping these fascists from dominating the public square and public discourse through forums like this, through the literature that you can find at refusefascism.org, and through our actions in the streets? Refuse Fascism is the only organized force that has consistently called out this regime as fascist since 2016, and for almost 4 years has mobilized people to stand up in the public square against its crimes. We have written and spread a pledge to the people of the world, which was signed by Cornel West, Noam Chomsky, Alyssa Milano, Chuck D, Layla Hathaway, and thousands of others. And at the end of the program, you're going to get to hear this entire pledge read by some of the signers. But as this pledge poetically states, no longer can we live with howling mobs resurrecting Jim Crow, fascist thugs attacking our protests, the right to vote stolen by defenders of the Confederacy. We will not worship the flag or accept a theocracy. We will not become collaborators on a march to a racist genocide. We will not hand the future to scorchers of the planet. A pledge to the people of the world is a call to the conscience of millions, summoning them to be an unstoppable force of nonviolent but massive protests against a virulent fascist movement in the most powerful country in the world. This has real stakes and consequences for all of humanity. This pledge must continue to resonate far and wide and become not only a needed political and moral compass, but the organized expression of a network of people ready to act with nonviolent determination to not allow fascism to grow and dominate and terrorize humanity. Now, another way you can donate to this movement is by participating on our online silent auction from now through December 27th. You can bid on beautiful visual art, music, and literature at a variety of starting bids. You can become the proud owner of Dred Scott's powerful print called Revolt, which was inspired by the paintings of Jacob Lawrence. You can get a private lesson from a chef, or beautiful quilted mug mats, the perfect landing zone for your winter mug of hot cocoa. And you can collect political posters that will be the artifacts and memorabilia of this turning point in history. It will not be soon enough that the Trump-Pence regime is gone from the White House, and they must never be allowed to come back. But we cannot let down our guard or go to sleep. So many lives still hang in the balance. And what is worth more than a future in which humanity does not need to fear fascist terror and mass death and has a chance to thrive? So I want to ask you to please give generously to this great cause. So now let's get back to our panelists. So we're all together now, and I know that everyone said very thought-provoking and provocative things. I don't know if any of you have questions that you want to ask each other, things you want to respond to. I have some questions of my own, but I wanted to see first if anybody wanted to start off an open discussion. All right, so go ahead.
I'll let Paul go first.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I mean, we got, as you might imagine, we got an actual doctor here. I got a doctor. Sometimes I never use in front of my name, but I'm not, as this right-wing guy pointed out recently, I shouldn't be doing that, right? Because unless you're a medical doctor, you're not a doctor. And Dr. Rice, I was really struck in your comments about something you noticed, which was the anti-urban bias. It's a big part of the fascist narrative from time back. I was thinking about that. That's something I should have mentioned, and I think you're right. Also, the emphasis on where people live and the conditions in which they live. For years, I was a research director at the Chicago Urban League, and just everything, always, every indicator, and this included diseases, just came down to location, and then the overlay of race and class with location. But I was curious if that locational issue includes food deserts and food issues. Is there something? I heard you about the genetics, and I heard you talking about the public transport and the jobs people have to have in inner city communities. Is there a comorbidity issue related to health, related to food and exercise, and all of that stuff? And I was also curious on what you're seeing about in terms of collateral damage. So, I mean, we know about, is COVID, are these numbers just an underestimation? Because we not only have the COVID diseases and the COVID deaths, but we have the people not coming in the hospitals for fear of coming into hospitals, and issues of services and whether services are available because so much medical personnel is directed to COVID. People aren't getting screenings. They aren't getting heart screenings. They aren't getting cancer screenings. I mean, is it possible that really this COVID death count really ought to be blown way up beyond what the official numbers are? So that's just some questions that arose when I was listening to the doctor speak.
Well, I'll try to speak to that. You had several in a row that are very important in the sense that when we look at the amount of deaths comparatively over the years, the number of deaths this year is almost double what it's been in the previous years, and actually many more than is accounted for by positive COVID tests. So when someone dies, why do they die? Well, I either know because they've come to my emergency department and I've known their disease and I've gotten a test and it says, COVID positive, SARS-CoV-2 virus, or you come in or someone dies and we don't know why they died. No one does a test. No one does an autopsy. Why? Because the morgues are completely overrun. They don't have the ability to do any more autopsies. They've stopped it. In fact, patients that come in that pass from various diseases, the families come in and say, I would like to know, just so that I want to know if I'm susceptible to that same disease, or I have that same gene, or I have that same predilection to what my loved one had, and I want to know for my children's sake what they may encounter. Can I get an autopsy? The answer is no right now. There aren't that, they're overrun with these things. So in that sense, our knowledge that we gain from various findings of why people die are lost. So all we can say is that since this disease hit, people are dying more, and they're dying from all sorts of things. And how much of those diseases are exacerbated by virus, a lack of access to care because, one, people are afraid to come in. I had a guy who said, yep, I think I had a heart attack, but I didn't want to come in because I thought I'd died from COVID. And I'm like, well, a heart attack will kill you too, So people are delaying diseases. Then there were deliberate delays because the ICUs were overrun and we needed to take up more and expand our intensive care unit capabilities. We took over general medicine wards. We've stopped doing general surgery cases that were semi-elective or elective because we couldn't put them in the places that the COVID patients. And so those patients had delayed treatments. So there, in terms of your the effects on the disease COVID, yeah, we don't know what the effects of food disparities are. But we do know what unhealthy foods do in killing you in a slow way, through hypertension, through obesity, through malnutrition. Even though you're overweight, you're malnourished because you don't have the right kind of proteins in a protein diet. You don't have the right balance between the fat, salt, proteins and carbohydrates. You don't have the vitamins. You don't have enough sunshine. You don't have enough vitamin. There's lots of things that are essential for health that are being constricted. You can't get outside. Nobody wants to go outside because of COVID. Well, how are you going to get your vitamin D and your sunshine unless you're outside? Now, that's not a license to just go outside and party, without masks and everything else. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about even just a walk in the sun is helpful. But you got to eat the right foods. And of course, these communities, which were deliberately designed to house and corral minorities in, Black people, Native Americans were put in concentration camps, the redlining. This is all well known as to, in terms of the disparities that people have had. And if you were in these red line districts, you weren't going to get loans. You couldn't fund your kids' education. You couldn't do a lot of things that a lot of white people could do automatically because of where they live. So where people lived, is not by accident.
Andy, did you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, there's so much that I'd like to talk about. I think I was also had the question of the the comorbidity factors and that are adversely affecting Black and Latino and Native American populations, and and I think it's important that the key thing that you were saying, Dr. Phil, is that it's not a genetic deficiency. It's a question of people's their social position in society and how the systemic racism and what jobs and communities people live in. I think that's very important, because one thing in terms of the fascist imperative is that, as we had Trump up there in Minnesota and very white, in fact, Germanic community, saying that the reason that he's better is because we have good genes, meaning white people of Aryan stock. It was really quite extraordinary bit of fascist ideology. I guess there's two things I would like to talk about. I want to take, if you have other questions, Coco. One is on this question of that, I remember when Phil, you were on our show, we talked about the cooperation that was going on behind the scenes and under the radar of the corporations, and people were cooperating, doctors around the world. But that event that got clamped down due to nationalism, and Paul also spoke of nationalism. And I think it's important that we actually explain to people a bit how this actually has retarded the development of the vaccine, of best practices. And this is true across the board from the system, but it was also amplified by the fascist regime here and in Brazil and in other places where the fascist regimes denied any and tried to block any cooperation, even the most limited cooperation. But the system itself and nationalism is a product of and a reflection of a competitive system. Of capitalism itself, of a system whose driving factor is the competition over the exploitation of people, and living in this highly globalized world. That's why I spoke about the children who are mining the coltan that goes into our phone, or the garment factories from South Asia to Latin America. All of this it has to do with the pursuit of profit at the expense of working people around the world, and then bringing that money together, bringing that accumulated profit together in national centers that are in competition with each other. And you see this, and the fascist regime's approach to this is, America first, and everything is tariffs and this kind of fight, and who's going to be first. Trump was incensed that the vaccine was brought forth in England before here. But this is something that's intrinsic in the system. We need to get to a place, I'll just say my opinion on this, we need to get to a place where this, to a different kind of society, not just here in this country, but around the world, where you actually could have a different way that the economy functioned, a different way things got produced through meeting the needs of society, such that we could overcome all these inequalities that are, you were speaking about, Phil, where people are living in ghettos, are locked in certain kind of jobs with very little ability to control the conditions under which they work and how they interact with the public. So this is something that, in terms of the revolutionary aspect of this, why we need a different system, and a worldwide system eventually of a communist world, is to get beyond this. And I was just taking a look at the Constitution for a New Socialist Republic that Bob Avakian authored, and under health and medicine, the fourth principle here is that the orientation under a genuine socialist system, not under a bit of tweaking of the system itself, shall be promoted and established as the standard for professionals and others in the field of medicine. Their orientation shall be to serve the people in the treatment of disease, and in other aspects of medicine, the sensibilities as well as the experience and knowledge of patients and of the people broadly shall be taken into account and drawn on as fully as basic requirements and a basic resource in the practice of medicine and development and application of medical science. You can't do that under this system. I mean, medicine in this country is basically for profit. And even in Canada and in Britain, where they have a form of socialized medicine, all the accounting of that whole health system is accountable to the bottom line and not to the needs of the people. And there's still that hierarchy, maybe less than here and certainly less than in the fascist regime, but still to really have that cooperation between the population and the patients and the doctors and the healthcare workers. And, I think, it's the rare doctor who talks to the nurse's aide, who actually often has a lot of insight into the particularities of each patient. And it's a whole different ethos of serve the people that's based on a different system. But I just wanted to actually maybe, Phil, for you to talk a little bit about how the cooperation among the medical professionals was thwarted. You mentioned, when you use the word WHO, you meant the World Health Organization, right? And yeah, and I don't know if people understand what happened there with, that how this, such as it is under the normal workings of the system, that international cooperation was undercut from people. So I just thought this was worth talking about because it really highlights that healthcare concentrates the nature of this system, and that's why it's such a killing proposition as we struggle to understand more about how our bodies function and more about disease. Because we should establish that COVID itself is not something that's this is a natural occurring disease, exactly probably by the incursion of cities into the natural habitat of other species. But nonetheless, it's not something that was cooked up in a lab by the evil Chinese or the evil Trump-Pence regime. It's just to be very clear on that point. Not that anybody here said that, but I want people to be clear on it. So anyway, that's what I just wanted to pose, this thing of nationalism and what it would take, how it actually impacted the treatment, and also, trying to get beyond it, how we're going to get beyond it.
Yeah, well, I think that there are several different pieces to what you just raised. I think that one I want to say, and I want to speak up for my international colleagues, that the collaboration has not ended. We found different ways to put forward different ideas for research to try and vet them, because that was one of the big things is all these multitude of ideas that came together to think about, one, what was this disease? How was it killing people? And many of the things that we thought back in April, we're finding out are completely wrong now. And so our strategies have changed in terms of trying to treat the patients. Things we did back in March and April, we're no longer doing right now in treating the second wave. And that's part of that accumulation of knowledge, not just in the United States, but globally. And we're beginning to see that the virus is mutated. The same virus that was in Wuhan is not exactly the same one that was in Europe and that hit New York City. It's the second wave. It's a slightly different, more contagious virus than the one that we were initially studying. So the collaboration continues. However, that kind of funding for those research efforts, those have to come from significant sources, deep pockets. And when you get to that, they come with all sorts of strings attached. That's where the government can actually put a clause in and say, no, you're not going to do this with so-and-so and so-and-so. They're not our partners. You have to find a U.S. partner. You have to collaborate in this way. It's okay to talk with the people in the UK, but no, you cannot speak with or you cannot collaborate with the folks in Shanghai. That we're not going to. We're going to keep control over that. We do not want the Chinese to beat us to this vaccine. We do not want them to develop alternative methods of treatment at our expense, quote unquote, even though it would be a shared knowledge. So there's different ways that they do this in order to allow you to use their money to do your research to actually look at this. And so that's why a large number of physicians that are in the academic medical centers are very much trying to vie for the funding from private sources, not the public sources. And unfortunately, if you're in a different country, that may not be available to you. So those are big aspects of how one of the things that we kind of treasure being able to try and thwart, because many of the physicians say, you know what we're doing now has never been done before. We have never had the ability to go online and just talk amongst ourselves on and collaborate with what we've done as if we're one people, as if we're one nation, as if we're one population. And one of the physicians, and he was from Sweden, he said, yes, well, don't forget about the animals. They get it too. the lions, the tigers, and so he was like saying, we can do this and we can make this available for all of the zoological spectrum. So I think that there's some beauty in it, but at the same time, the ugliness of the system raises its head with the nationalism and the geopolitical aspects of what it would mean and how it would validate one country's social system, China's, versus another country's social system, the US fascist, if who gets what first and how. And oddly enough, all of them are pursuing multiple strategies of vaccines. Both China has an mRNA vaccine. They also have an adenovirus vaccine, just like the UK does, just like the United States does. They also have one that they've injected into insects and having the insects produce the proteins, and then they inject the proteins into humans and they develop an immune response. So there's various different ideas. Who thought of using insects to produce a vaccine? But it's called the insect vaccine. Fascinating. But it came from somebody who was just an ordinary physician who said, this seems logical. Why not try it? And so they were given the means to try it, but other countries were not.
Paul, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I didn't actually mention nationalism. I should have. I did mention federalism as a problem in this country. I did a bit of traveling as COVID was breaking out, particularly between Iowa and Illinois, and it was just absurd. All the different rules. This is a society global-wide disease that needs to be met with a certain amount of consistency and centralized command and standards across jurisdiction. And we have these red states and these blue states, and then red parts of blue states that are rebelling against commands coming down from state capitals. There's a kind of federalism at the heart of the world capitalist system. I remember the late Emanuel Wallerstein and his definition of the world capitalist system as one unified, integrated world economy and multiple nation states. What do we have, more than 200 nation states around the world? So there is this problem. Bertrand Russell used to write about this. He used to say we need one world government to try and handle one world capitalist system in order not to have a nuclear war. Of course, Russell was writing at a time when the threat of nuclear war was a big deal. One place that I noticed that nationalism and nativism and anti-Chinese conspiracism came into play was early on. I saw Trump sort of using travel bans on China and the notion of building walls as a way to pretend that he was actually doing anything. They came up again and again in rallies. I really did take action on COVID. I did this belated travel ban, and then we're building these walls. It was interesting to see how the nationalism became a false pretext or a false way of claiming to have done something. Germs don't honor walls quite the way he seemed to be talking about them. So there was that. Andy, I did have a question for you, if I can do that, Coco. Can I ask Andy a question?
Yes, you can ask Andy a question, then I have a couple of questions.
I was curious. You seem to have studied, actually, the history of fascism going all the way back in its European context. Am I right in this sense that this hatred of science, this anti-science, which is related in this country to a distrust of the professional class? There's a whole big narrative about the professional class. Is this different? Is this distinctive in the American model of fascism? What was the attitude towards medical science? I had a number of sort of Trump and lefty hotshot academic intellectuals lecturing me and telling me that if Trump was a real fascist, he would have come in with big state command and ordered everyone to mask up, and he would have gone gung-ho in a top-down kind of way with a scientific mask and social distancing ordering approach. I don't know if you get the gist of my issue there, but how does this link up with other fascist national traditions and examples?
Well, there was a lot of bad science in in Italy and in Germany. I mean, they thought they were being scientific in some ways, and for example, in the realm of law, Hitler and the Nazi Party studied the Confederacy and the racial laws in the United States, and to understand, they thought it was a little too extreme, actually, that we went down to the 1/16th. I say we. I mean, the Confederacy went down to 1/16th part blood to decide what racial group, and of course, racial groups themselves is not a scientific concept. They weren't the only ones who believed that prior to them, but when they arose, we had Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States, who was a stone cold racist and supported the Ku Klux Klan and all of this. So racism was deep in the United States, but they did study this, and then they did all kinds of horrific pseudo-scientific experiments on Jewish inmates in the concentration camps. So they had their science, but they remade science to serve ends. And look, it wasn't just them. Some of this is also, in the parts of the communist movement that we've studied and repudiated, including that you start from what you want to happen, and then you develop a theory to get to your desired ends. And this is why I spent, maybe a third of what I talked about bringing forward the importance of it. And this has been a very pioneering thing of Bob Avakian. Communism was always, when Marx developed it, a scientific approach to reality. He was very inspired by and followed closely Charles Darwin's work on evolution. But there were parts of communism that were not scientific, including in the first socialist states, that actually contributed to shortcomings and even grievous mistakes in some situations. And, when people say, well, why do you promote Bob Avakian so much? Because he's actually solved that problem and put the science of revolution on more scientific footing. So this is why, just to get to the question, there's, in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, there's been a premium on science. But the question is, are you going to be thoroughly and consistently scientific, or are you going to allow the ends that you're desiring to dictate the science itself? Do you go where it leads you? So these are important principles that we have to get into. But yeah, it is true that there was a scientific approach within this, the Nazi Party, but it was actually not good science. It was terrible science for the most part. There were weapons that were developed on both sides, and especially in the U.S. side, both during the war, and modes of fighting that were just horrific, and the same was true of World War I, that were more a product of the competition between nations and the development of imperialism. This is why I'm saying that even as there was with an internet, and there is very important cooperation between doctors in different countries, ultimately that is constrained by the workings of the system, including it's going to get there's two things I'm interested in. Coco, you should ask your questions. One is in the production and distribution, especially the distribution of the vaccine on a world scale. I think we can be fairly sure that the motive of profit in companies that are rooted in different nations is going to be a very big determinant of who gets what and when. And the other thing is and why I've been so much emphasis on the scientific approach to reality among the people is conspiracy theories. So, all right, we talked about the lunatic theories, but, Refuse Fascism just got a letter from a follower and somebody who, I don't know if it's a follower of Refuse Fascism, but somebody who was very taken with it, basically putting forward that we really should go to the experts like Robert Kennedy Jr., who will tell you how terrible vaccines are, and this was his letter was just filled with bullshit, unscientific rumor mongering, conspiracy theories, and that we face a problem now. I've heard that somewhere between 20 and 40% of the population won't even take the vaccine, assuming that it is a safe vaccine, which we have to rely on, the multiplicity of studies, and it seems like they have produced something that is safe, not without other effects that are unwelcome, but in some cases, but that essentially are safe, and they can prevent a deadly disease, even if they might produce headaches and other possible what they call side effects, but really are just ancillary effects that are more desirable than the main one they're working on. So I don't know if that speaks to your question.
Andy, that actually leads to a pair of questions that I wanted to ask. One came in from someone in the audience, but I wanted to ask it with a bigger question that I think you all could speak to, that relates to epistemology. Somebody asked, could you speak to how we might best understand the safety of the vaccine, not just immediately, but in the long run? And that's mainly a question for you, Phil, but I wanted to also bring out that so many people, I mean, really millions of people in this country actually don't know how to evaluate what's true. They don't know how to evaluate evidence. And you know, if you spend some time with these conspiracy theories, they're actually like throwing out what they're calling evidence. You know, we have the alternative facts. You have, you know, their proof. Alex Jones did this all the time. He's got proof. But people don't actually know how to evaluate whether what's being presented is true or not. And I think it would be helpful to hear, like, for example, you know, Paul, you as a historian, how do you go about that question? And Phil as a medical doctor, and Andy as a communist and a writer, you know, but how do we help because I think it's been a really big stumbling block to get people engaged, politically engaged with stopping this regime, and that many checked out because they did not know how to evaluate what was true. So I think we should start with the first question, but then expand it out to this question of evaluating evidence and evaluating truth. So Phil, again, that question was, how can we best understand the safety of the vaccine, you know, not just immediately, but in the long run?
So the answer is that, first of all, there needs to be no tampering with the evidence, with the facts, the research. So that's one of the things, is you gotta start with transparency so that everybody can see and evaluate the data that comes through. And there's a reason we do the trials to evaluate the safety of anything that gets brought forward. First, to determine whether it causes harm in a small group, then a larger group, then a very large group. Because if 1 in 100,000 gets seriously ill, when you magnify that up to 7 billion people, that's a lot of people that gets hurt. You know, that could get hurt by doing this. So that's why you do large numbers. And when they did the large numbers, there was a theoretical view of what we should expect based on the fact that our own immune systems and our bodies produce mRNA for every type of protein that's in our body. That's how it gets produced, both in your brain, your heart, your lungs, etc. And so understanding that this is a disease that we're learning about every single day, and the treatment now will not be the treatment in 2 months from now. And that we will find out more. And that's the process by which we're going to learn about this disease and its effect in terms of the vaccine. Now, this vaccine has not gone through the entire process, but here's the point. It's killed over 1 million people throughout the world. It's killed over, 300,000 people in this country. The question you have to ask is, given what we know, and what we know shows it to be extremely safe, given what you know, do the risks outweigh the benefits? And the answer is no. That's what you have to recognize, and that's what you have to see with what's in front of us. So you have to look at the data. You have to have people that can help you interpret the data. You have to ask your questions like you do now so that the answers that come forward make sense and that can be backed up with some logic. So that's how I answer that, in the sense that the vaccine appears to be, with all the data that we've seen, completely safe, but there's a couple of caveats. They have not tested it in children less than 16, and they have not tested it in pregnant women. Now, part of the sign up to be part of the study, the original 30,000, was you can't be pregnant. Well, it turns out in every single vaccine trial, a good portion of the women who actually signed up and declared they weren't pregnant actually ended up being pregnant, or didn't know that they were pregnant. And that's actually how they got the initial safety data on pregnancy, the initial safety data on pregnancy. So the next step for Pfizer, Moderna, and the rest of them that have finished their phase 3 is to now evaluate them in children and in pregnant women.
So what about this bigger question, society-wide, of not having a methodology of evaluating, even looking at evidence and evaluating what's true? I think what's very helpful, what you said, Phil, about the looking at data. This was something that one of these fascist senators was asking somebody who was ousted. I can't remember, it was several months ago, but he was talking about anecdotal evidence as opposed to data. That's something that, I don't know if this particular senator knew about that or not, but it seems millions of people don't actually have that knowledge of that science collects data on a large scale, and that's what you look at. But I'd like to hear, Paul, your take on this, and Andy, your take on, how we help people to understand what's true.
Well, I actually have been dealing with a couple of friends who have backgrounds in anti-vaxxism, and it's hard to know what to say. What I'm struck by, like I said, my doctorate's in history. It's not in medical science. It's not in public health. But I've been trained and socialized and affect my household in such a way that I have a kind of respect for credentials and a read on who's within the professional class who's telling the truth and who isn't. And I am numerate. There are rules, even in history, thesis, evidence, conclusion, the things don't square up. What I'm finding with a lot of the folks who are questioning this is a zeal, a conspiratorial zeal, a determination that they're right, completely beyond even any consideration of evidence. And I don't know entirely where that comes from, but I think that part of it comes from television and the internet. I think there's just an almost automatic delivery of confirmation bias information now in the so-called social media world and on Twitter. You can just instantaneously find a quote-unquote study that confirms your suspicions right off the bat, and that's sort of the end of the story. There's a decredentializing process that's taken place in part through the internet. At least that's what I find that I'm up against sometimes. But at a certain point, whether on vaccines, I don't, it's over my pay grade, right? And I have to try and process and evaluate and trust folks. I admit that. And that seems to have been blown up to a certain extent. And science has been misused, and people have been lied to. There were terrible experiments in the minority community. There's real work that needs to be done with regard, I think, particularly the minority community with regard to science. And that's not surprising to me. I suspect the fears are going to decline over time. This is one of my hopes. that as more and more people get vaccinated and people observe that they don't die, and guess what, they didn't come down with the disease, I think that's probably the way past this fear of the vaccine. That's what I'm banking on. Anyway.
Well,
Go ahead, Amy.
yeah, well, look, the point is not that everybody becomes an astrophysicist or a surgeon or a molecular biologist, but there's some basic things about science. And I would recommend to people, this is available online. It's also available from Revolution Books online. A book called Science and Revolution on the Importance of Science and the Application of Science to Society, the New Synthesis of Communism and the Leadership of Bob Avakian by Ardea Skybreak, who was trained as an evolutionary biologist. And, she quotes Neil deGrasse Tyson in the beginning that science allows you to confront and identify problems, to recognize problems and figure out how to solve them, rather than to run away from them. And as I said, and it's it's a point that she makes in this book as well, that if you don't have a scientific approach to reality, you are a mark for any charlatan of whether it's a charlatan doctor or a political leader or whatever. You have no way to judge anything. Now the point is, if you sent me two cents of data on the different ways to manipulate RNA, I wouldn't be able to do very much with it. I don't have that training. But I think a scientific approach is something that people can learn. Well, one, it's not just who has let's look up, did they go to Harvard Medical School or did they go to a medical school someplace else? That's not what impresses me. It's what is the it matters. It's part of the picture, I suppose. But what is the basic argument? What is a consensus of people in a field? Are they saying? Could they be wrong? Yes. Is it possible that, and it's actually quite likely that in every field people are influenced by the prevailing social relations. So there's been tremendous racism in the field of medicine, which since the 1960s has begun. There's been struggle over this thing. There's Doctors Without Borders was formed at a certain point in the last several decades, where people are trying to cooperate, where we're looking into things, where things like the Tuskegee experiment have been exposed and revealed, and these are important things. But you have to look at the entirety of it and get out of this way that, these conspiracy theories is that they take random sets of facts and they throw them at people and say, well, there's the evidence. This letter that we got at Refuse Fascism said, well, the corporations they planned COVID because Naomi Klein says that there's disaster capitalism. That means the capitalists profit off of these crises. Therefore, they must have created this. You see, it seems logical, but it's illogical. Where did this come from? How did it develop? These are the kinds of things that have to be asked, and historians have to ask it too. And you got to go to multiple sources. There's things you can learn, just for example, from original sources. It's really important what people on the street say about different things, but then you need a lot of that data to be able to figure out whether it's actually true, and then you need people who do have had the privilege of education and a scientific method, and you need to learn from them. We're at the very beginning historically of humanity actually being able to practice science. In fact, I think it's probably still true that that there's more scientists alive today than there were in the history of humanity up to this point. At least that was true a few years ago. Maybe that's no longer the case, but each year. But the fact is, it's new. It comes with, that's part of the development of the, all the factories and technologies and that we have is all relatively new and that arose along with capitalism. And our contention, my contention, is that the capitalism at this point is a tremendous barrier to that being able to be both to really flourish and to be able to incorporate the creativity of the masses of people, whether it be in medicine, in the treatment of people in the hospital, or more importantly, or just as important, is the prevention of disease. You know, people much malign what was going on in China before capitalism was reestablished in the late 70s, mid 70s. But they had these barefoot doctors, and they prevented tremendous number of diseases by relying on the peasants themselves and teaching them in basic hygiene and how to drain swamps and all kinds of things. There's a tremendous knowledge that people have, native peoples have tremendous knowledge in herbs and different kinds of things that has to then be combined with scientific knowledge of the molecular structure of these things and how they can be manipulated and used. So anybody can learn some basic ways of saying, what's the evidence for it? You read an article, what's the evidence? Does it add up? And what then? And you should turn to varying sources to be able to find out. Read a dissenting opinion, but pretty much people go along in this society with what the crowd wants. There's a great play that I would recommend if people want to understand the negative process called The Crucible by a playwright named Arthur Miller that was written about during the anti-communist scare of the early 50s, but it uses the Salem witch trials at the formation of, in New England in the 17th century. So anyway, that's just some stuff.
Well, we're coming up on our 2 hours. I want to give everybody a chance to make any closing comments. One thing I wanted to say was I've actually just lost the thread of what I wanted to say. It was something related to what you just said, Andy. That I think that everybody who does, say that science matters and truth matters, that one place that we can start is by actually really holding people to that and holding each other to that and really challenging ourselves and challenging others who are on the side of humanity to really fully confront reality and fully confront, how truth is undermined and how we can actually get at the truth. I think we could talk all night. I have lots more questions. One of my questions was about how much the regime actually did come up against subjective reality and how that affected them. I don't think we're going to be able to get into it in the next 3 minutes, but Paul, if you want to write about that would be great. But I'm going to let you all make any closing comments you want, and then I'm going to say a few things to the audience, and we're going to close out. Why don't we start with Andy?
You always start with me. I just spoke for a while. Why don't you let one of my co-presenters?
Let somebody else.
I've been talking I just spoke for a while. I think it'd be better to let others speak for a moment. I'll try to say something brief at the end. No promises on the brief.
Phil, do you have any closing comments for us?
Sure. I think that, the discussion about science is really important. I think understanding what science is and demystifying it is critical. And understanding that it's a method to understand the world. And anybody can grasp it. It's just you have to unlearn a bunch of junk that you've been taught that really isn't true. And then you begin to see the pathways to actually grasping the methodology and then being able to figure out things for yourself. On the other hand, the people who do grasp it and who do understand it need to stop talking in methodologies and actually breaking it down to people, and so that they can understand it and wield it themselves. And I think that it's one big aspect of this fascist regime that they hit upon the methodology and hit upon science and try and denigrate it and denigrate anybody who's part of that. And so I think that these aspects are something that we have to grasp, that it's a conscious effort. And this is part of the fascist regime. And just like the WHO under fascism is one of these international organizations that is trying to, control the world, and they have to pull out of it. This is that fascist ideology. Where does it come from? let's learn from the previous fascist outlooks and thinking. This is a clear symptom of this. So understanding when they do these things, when they attack scientists, when they attack the methodology, they are actually creating the soil for a fascist regime to take hold and strengthen. The more the masses of people do not have this methodology, the more they're at the mercy of these folks. So it's critical that the masses of people and people all around the world embrace this methodology so mankind can move forward.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Phil. Paul, you have some closing comments?
I'll say quickly, I really hope and pray that we get this COVID thing under control as soon as possible. One thing I've noticed in the Trump years is that, bizarre as it sounds to say, an even bigger catastrophe, as far as I'm concerned, in long-term consequences, which is runaway, anthropogenic, I call it capitalogenic, climate change. And the climate catastrophe has just been kicked to the curb of the news for 4 years. It's just really insane. And again, we have the anti-science and the conspiracy theories and the claims of hoax there. I'm very concerned about these issues of hostility to and fear of vaccination. The two forms of the fear I've run across are minority fear, which relates to the ugly history, stuff like the Tuskegee pilots. And the other one is something some of what Andy was quoting from. Well, it's for the big pharmaceutical corporations, and so they're just in it for it's all they're going to profit from it. So it almost just be a conspiracy. And this is where I think I'm so glad to be on this panel with Dr. Phil Rice tonight. It's very important for doctors for countering that left skepticism. I guess it's left populist, anti-corporate. It's very important to hear from doctors who clearly have left values, right? Who might actually be socialists and have a critical take on capitalism. I listen to Dr. Phil, and I just can't possibly believe that Dr. Phil is a tool of the pharmaceutical industry. He clearly has just this whole conspiracy theory that all these doctors must be in hock to, or captive to big pharma. Dissolves when you hear a doctor with progressive and left anti-fascist, anti-imperialist values speak on that. And I think it's very important to have minority voices. They're going to have to speak up to it within. I mean, I don't know that white people are going to be able to go into the south or the west side of Chicago and lecture folks on their need to take vaccines. It's very important that they have folks with credentials out of those communities. I've been very critical of Obama over the many years, but it wouldn't be a bad thing if that's not a bad idea for him to roll up his arm and take that shot on television, insofar as that might have some impact down here in the south side and out there on the west side. So anyway, I'm done.
Paul, it's always a pleasure. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. And Andy.
Well, this has been this is the third in our series of these forums on fascism, and I'm glad that Paul could be on this one and bring his historical knowledge and insight to this. And as always, Phil, you're bringing a lot of things that a lot of important information that we need. And it's interesting that there are some of the things that you actually said in March that were borne out, and things that actually have changed. You pointed that out. We could talk about that. But I guess I want to emphasize this, that it's a tremendous impediment to any form of social progress if people don't know how to approach the world as it actually is. And obviously this fascist lunacy is put this up into high relief, just the absolute insanity of this QAnon stuff, and basically I don't know how many thousands, almost 30,000 lies out of Trump. But I think, it is important that that the progressive community also not just start from the conclusion they want, but start from reality itself and ask those questions. And it's very important to, first off, it's very important to be able to ask the question, why? What happened? Well, I think you have to start with what happened. What is any one thing? What is it? What is this COVID virus? People need to understand that. and not start with, well, it must be something that's coming from some satanic place, or it's coming from the corporations, which you can actually have a view that the corporations are Satan, and not understanding that this is the corporations themselves and capitalism developed as part of human history, and it's actually a very temporary phenomenon if we have anything to say about it, which we believe that you can move beyond it. So you have to determine based on reality if something is true, and not actually on who's saying it. In terms of the importance of having more Black and Latino doctors, I think that's extremely important, but because then people have some shared experience that they can bring, and people shouldn't be kept out of these professions. But I have to differ here that I think if somebody knows the cure, that my first question to the doctor is not what color are you, what nationality are you, but do you have a scientific approach to this? I really hope that, and I know that people did take the Salk and Sabin vaccines, in the other order Salk, then the Sabin vaccine, and these were white guys who developed this in part with teams. That's not the determinant of whether or not something is true. We have to overcome this systemic racism, oppression of whole peoples, the brain drain from of medical personnel from Africa and Asia, sucked into the imperialist countries. These are terrible things that we need to, that are also a product of the system. But the criteria has to be whether something is true, not who's saying it. And this applies in the political sphere. I mean, I'm just going to say one more thing. We ran into part of what happened with why people did not take to the streets that now has left us in a situation where, yes, the Biden-Harris regime will take power, the administration rather. They're going to take power, and that's a good thing. It's in the sense of it's not Trump. But it would have been far better if instead of having the initiative in the streets be with these Trumpites now, if it had been, there had been people in the streets on this side of the equation. But one reason people weren't, we just have to speak bluntly about these things, is there was this wonderful movement after the murder of George Floyd by these racist pigs, and people took to the streets for Black Lives Matter, white, black, brown. It was an incredible thing. But then as this fascism loomed, which was sending, paramilitaries after these protests, their movement was murdering people protesting this, and they still are. They went and burned AME church, black churches, Black Lives Matter posters in the streets of Washington this past weekend. But people said, well, the problem with Refuse Fascism is that some of the people leading it are white. That's not right. Or that's a divergent from what we're doing. In other words, you've got a lot of this, what is true is who's saying it, not whether it is true. Now, if somebody is putting forth something that is degrading people because of who they are, because they're gay, lesbian, trans, because they're Latino, Native American, or black, or for whatever reason, that has to be opposed. But you have to take a look at everything and decide, does it correspond to reality? Does it actually correspond to what people need? These are the important things that have to be done, and in the course of that, we will be better able to fight against all the racial and gender oppression that exists. It will not weaken that struggle; it will strengthen that struggle. And those who have been historically part of groups that have had the privilege of and not been under the gun of this society, we need to think about those things, and we need to act on it, but not to hold back when we actually have an answer for people. So yes, I was in South Chicago last year with a tour, and we were bringing revolution out to the masses of people, and let me just tell you, people welcomed it when they understood what we were talking about. In other words, there were people who welcomed it, and they were actually glad to see marches in the streets, just as they were to see Refuse Fascism, to see black, brown, and white uniting Asians and people of all different genders. That's a great strength if we can do that. And it has to be on the basis of equality and overcoming the oppression of peoples because of their background and who they are. So I do want to push on this because I think it's holding up holding back people from the kind of struggle they need to free us from this fascism, but even more fundamentally, to free us from an oppressive and exploitive system. So anyway, sorry I got a little more on a soapbox there, but I think this is just, the questions of epistemology are just so important, and this is one of them.
Thank you, Andy. And I think we need to continue this conversation in different ways. And I want to say, Andy, it's been really fun to do these 3 forums with you. And I think that we got into some very, very deep and important content that I hope that if you enjoyed these, please spread them, because really the world will be a better place if millions of people could engage with this. I want to say to everybody watching, please stay in touch with us. Follow us at Refuse Fascism on social media, all platforms, and at the RevComs. You can also check out content at revcom.us and refusefascism.org. You can look for Paul's articles at counterpunch.org, and you can pick up his book, Hollow Resistance. And so go to YouTube and subscribe to at the RevComs or the RevComs, and watch the Revolution Nothing Less show every Thursday. And don't forget to check out the online auction at refusefascism.org and donate. Donate as much as you can, because we have to take the leadership and responsibility to stop a fascist America. Sign and share a pledge to the people of the world, not only for ourselves, but for all of humanity. So good night, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Good night, all.
Good night.
In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump-Pence regime must go.
We pledge that we will speak, we will stand, we will shout and march together every day to stop a regime that imperils the people of the world and the earth itself.
We will take to the streets day after day and call forth others. We demand Trump Pence out now. We will not stop until they're gone.
We do not comply with the regime putting targets on the backs of Black, brown, and indigenous people, denying women rights and control of their own bodies, forcing LGBTQ people back into the closet.
We do not accept a society ruled by hate and bigotry, ignorance and brutality, demeaning and cursing other people's countries, and threatening them with destruction.
There can be no more children torn from parents and locked in cages. No more fire and fury from the mouth of a demented bully with his finger on the nuclear trigger. No more mass COVID death from science-hating lunacy.
No more law and order of official terror by bullets, batons, and tear gas.
No longer can we live with howling mobs resurrecting Jim Crow, fascist thugs attacking our protests.
The right to vote stolen by defenders of the Confederacy.
We will not worship the flag or accept the theocracy.
We will not become collaborators on a march to a racist genocide.
We will not hand the future to scorchers of the planet.
4 more years, 4 more months, and it could be too late. Too late to change the course of history as the Trump-Pence regime sabotages the election and drags humanity to the very edge of extinction itself.
Here and now, we pledge to unite in our millions, rising together in nonviolent resistance to stop a great horror.
We pledge to stay in the streets, overcoming fear and uncertainty until this American fascism is brought to a halt.
We pledge our determination to prevail over a regime that imperils the people of the world and the earth itself.
In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.